Okay, so I'm Emily and I'm part of the Open Energy Phase 3 research team. And we put this briefing together because the project increasingly involves people with a very diverse set of backgrounds, both from across the energy sector and beyond. So we wanted to put together a short set of information to ensure a base level of shared understanding between all participants. To do this, the briefing is structured in 3 phases. Firstly, I will give a brief recap of the traditional structures of electricity and gas sectors and the approach to energy governance in the UK. I will then talk through some trends influencing energy system change at present. And finally, I'll focus more on the open energy ecosystem to discuss where we sit in the policy landscape, some common terminology, and challenges and debates informing the open energy approach. So to start off with, this is a slide to give an overview of the legacy structure of the electricity sector in the UK. A caveat that this is obviously a simplified version, so it doesn't include all players, but I've just focused on kind of big players in the traditional sector. So to start off with the grey boxes, which will be read from left to right across the screen, these give you an idea of the traditional kind of linear one-way journey of electricity in the system. You start off with generation, which has historically been conducted through fairly large, centralised and mainly thermal power plants, with some large renewables, so for example, hydropower dams. Electricity would then move through the transmission network, which is a national network of high voltage cables that transfers electricity over long distances. Transmission is managed by 3 operators in the UK, which are listed on the diagram below. Electricity is then transformed to a lower voltage and passed through regional distribution networks. There are 14 distribution network areas in the UK, owned by 6 commercial groups that you can see in the diagram below. The final stage of the electricity supply journey is through supply. Retail supply companies operate in a competitive market in the UK, but have historically been dominated by the big 6 companies, which I've listed the logos of below. One thing you may notice is that I've listed OVO as well as SSE because they SSE sold their retail branch to OVO last year. On top of this journey, you have an organisation called National Grid ESO, or Electricity System Operator, sometimes also known as the Control Room, who are the organisation that is ultimately responsible for balancing supply and demand across the grid. I've also noticed that you can see certain actors, such as Scottish Power, in several phases of the electricity journey. This is a type of company organisation called vertical integration, where one company will operate in several different parts of the network. So moving on to a brief overview of the gas sector. It's structured in really quite a similar way to the electricity sector, as you can see again from the grey boxes. Obviously, instead of generation, we start with extraction and transportation. In the UK context, most of this happens either offshore or overseas. So gas will then arrive to the UK through a variety of ports and is put into the transmission grid. Similarly to electricity transmission being national and high voltage, the gas transmission network is a network of high pressure pipes across the whole country that is owned and operated by the gas transmission system operators. You then move into distribution, again very similar. These are lower pressure networks that operate regionally. There are 8 network areas across the UK which are owned by 4 commercial groups known as gas DNOs. And finally, again, you have supply. I won't go through this as I've said it before, but just to highlight that some supply companies operate both in electricity and gas, and these are called horizontally integrated companies. Once again, you have National Grid as an organisation sitting on top of the system as the ultimate system balancer. Just to note, though, that National Grid in this context is not the same company as National Grid ESO. They are 2 separate companies, both under the National Grid group. So to move on to talking a little bit about electricity or energy governance, the governance landscape is mature and complex. It was rooted in the 1980s, developed under Thatcherite state rollback and privatisation of the energy networks. Since then, the governance landscape has evolved in layers that include both public and private actors, including industry self-governance. The overall landscape is extremely complex, so I've just chosen 3 particular governance tools to talk you through that are most directly relevant to the open energy ecosystem. The first is licenses. So that's on the left-hand side of the screen. Essentially, companies performing certain activities in energy markets require a license to operate. There are 5 standard license types, so that is generation, transmission, interconnection, distribution and supply. And there are also a smaller number of non-standard licenses. So for example, Smart TCC are a company license to provide the infrastructure for smart meter communications in the UK. Moving on to the RIO framework, RIO stands for Revenue equals Incentives plus Innovation plus Output. And the RIO framework is a framework used by Ofgem to regulate energy networks. The framework periods are negotiated every 5 years, and new periods start in 2021 or 2023, as you can see on the slide, depending on the networks in question. These periods are very significant, as essentially they determine network investments and planning cycles and what networks can charge for their services within the RIO period. Finally, we come to codes, and codes are a form of industry self-governance. So the code is maintained by its signatories within industry and modified by the same players. However, the codes are also integrated into more formal regulation in some ways, as Ofgem licensees are required to maintain, become party to, or comply with relevant industry codes. There are 11 electricity and 5 gas codes overall, and various ones are relevant to open energy, so I won't go into those in detail as they get quite complex quite quickly. So I've talked a bit about the legacy structure of the energy sector. What's happening now? There are, as I'm sure you'll be all aware, quite a few dimensions of energy system change that can be conceptualized in various different ways and kind of affect different actors in different ways as well. The heuristic that I've chosen to use is called the 4Ds, or 4 dimensions of energy system change. These 4 dimensions are decarbonisation, digitalisation, decentralisation and democratisation, and together they form 4 interlinked trends that are shaping the direction and structure of energy system change. A small caveat, some people also describe a 5th dimension of demand reduction, but for me that's encompassed in the diagram that you can see on this slide. I won't go into too much detail about the specific trends, but what I will say is the upshot of all of the trend linkage is that we're seeing a vast increase in energy system complexity, uncertainties, space for new interactions, and lots more new moving parts. In a recent Open Energy webinar, someone actually said, we have to start seeing the energy system as potentially millions of interconnected devices and actors. Now, this is an incredibly different system to the fairly linear, one-directional systems I described on slides 2 and 3. So what is the upshot of this change? There are many different areas of change, including technical, skills, etc. But one big one to highlight is that roles and responsibilities in the sector are changing quite significantly. I'll go through a few of these now. So the first is that we're seeing a lot more market entrants enter the sector. So this could include things like startups or entrants from other sectors that may be established players now looking to enter the energy market. We're also seeing novel business models develop. So for example, software as a service, heat as a service, companies offering analytics, forecasting or other data services. Relatedly, we're seeing the development of different value streams, and these are developing alongside new markets. So for example, flexibility markets, which offer a route to monetize things like storage or demand side response. We're also seeing different roles developing for existing actors that both cover existing commercial players, but also governance actors. So just for example, Ofgem, the regulator, is now having to be far more involved in data governance than they would have done 5 years ago. Relatedly, we're seeing a whole set of new governance challenges emerge. So I've already just mentioned data governance, but we're also seeing, for example, changes in customer protection, having to deal with new types of third parties or new consequences of automation. So I've spoken a bit now about energy system change, and I wanted to move on to look at where open energy sits within the landscape. So in terms of the emerging policy landscape, first of all, open energy sits right in the middle of 2 very significant policy development areas, looking at net zero and digital and data. So to start with the circle on the left-hand side, open energy has been explicitly designed to align with data policy and digital best practice initiatives being developed in cross-economy spaces. So for example, it aligns with the industrial strategy and the BEIS smart data work, to take a couple of examples. Moving on to the right-hand circle, so within the energy sector, open energy supports recommendations published by the Energy Data Task Force in 2019, and also the Modernising Energy Data Collaboration's best practice guidance. Data is linked to net zero because data is essentially at the heart of a more flexible and low carbon electricity system, as I outlined in previous slides. And this relationship was really foregrounded in the recent energy white paper that was published in December 2020, as well as previous BEIS energy strategies looking at flexibility and smartness. The final piece of this ecosystem is that open energy can also help regulated entities meet new license conditions around data for net zero introduced in the RIIO-T process that I previously described. So as I've been talking about data policy, one of the particular requirements of the Modernising Energy Data Best Practice Guidance is for actors to follow the presumed open principle. This outlines how actors should use a process of triage to determine whether data relating to common assets, so for example network constraints, can be made fully open, or whether it requires certain access controls where there are legitimate issues with making data fully open. Legitimate issues can include things like privacy, security, negative consumer impact, or commercial impact, for example. If data cannot be made fully open, that means it cannot be essentially put on the internet for anyone to use for any purpose. There are two broad categories of access controls that can be employed. At the more extreme end, there's closed data. So this is data that cannot be shared outside the organization, or it can only be shared using a custom bilateral license that's quite restrictive. In the middle, you have a category of shared data. So that's data that cannot be made fully open, but can be shared within authorized a trusted set of actors under a common set of conditions called a preemptive license. Open energy interacts with both open and shared data in the sector. So first of all, open data will be discoverable and searchable using Open Energy Search and Knowledge Graph function. The Open Energy Governance platform will then provide the secure trust framework and preemptive license to increase liquidity in shared data across the sector. So moving on to what happens within the open energy ecosystem, the purpose of this slide is to run through some common acronyms that you may come across in the project. I won't spend too long on the energy sector actor column as these are pretty self-evident, and we will share slides in addition to this recorded briefing. But to go through a couple of notes on the open energy ecosystem. First of all, we'll be using the acronym API, which stands for Application Programming Interface. For those for a non-computing background, this refers to computing interfaces determining how different software intermediaries interact. Where we use the acronym DP, this refers to data provider or data publisher, and those are actors that make their data available via the open energy ecosystem. An EDSP is an energy data service provider, which is a type of third party operating in the open energy ecosystem. EDSPs will provide data services to end users that can encompass a variety of functions, for example, data aggregation, cleaning, or potentially also some more advanced analytical services. We envisage EDSPs to operate in a competitive environment. The OEGP stands for Open Energy Governance Platform, which is the technical and governance architecture creating the trust framework in which shared data is exchanged. This covers items such as participant identification, authentication and authorization, data access management, liability management, and so on. And finally, MVP stands for our minimum viable product, which for us is to deliver private and public betas based around the delivery of our use case, which I'll explain on the next slide. And just a quick note to say as well, we will be consulting on our working glossary very soon, starting with our advisory groups at the end of March 2021. So this link will be circulated more broadly for consultation soon. Moving on to a bit more terminology, we thought it might be useful to go through a few operational and technical terms that we will be using in the project. So to start with the operational column, first of all, we use the use case to mean an outline of a specific situation in which open energy can be used. Our use case is supporting local authority retrofit of a housing development or community, and delivering this use case is our minimum viable product or MVP for this project phase. Additional use cases will be recorded, and if you're listening to this briefing and you have a suggestion, please let us know, because we're keeping tabs on all of these for future. But these are not the core focus of what we deliver in Open Energy Phase 3. Moving on, a user story is an outline of how a typical user in a particular use case might find, interact, and pay for and resolve any problems with a particular product. So for us, we have a user story in which a local authority employee called Leah uses open energy for the use case that I previously described. Business case for us means the commercial justification for a particular product or service. So our membership advisory group will be talking about this quite extensively. And also we use the terminology public to private beta, which means an iterative process of product release, first to a small closed group of actors and secondly to the public by the end of July 2021. A couple of other things in this column is that we talk quite a lot about policy and about code, both of which are terms that can be used quite variably for different things. So if you're interacting with us and you spot any inconsistencies in the use of these terms, please let us know and we'll try and specify what we mean by policy or code whenever these are used. Looking towards technical terminology, there's a few things around data that we wanted to go through. First of all, metadata is data that gives information about what is contained within a particular data set. And we hold the stance that metadata should be open wherever possible. A data standard is a standardized agreement determining how data is categorized, described, and recorded. So for example, formats, definitions, structure, etc. Data tiers are used or will be used within the governance platform in Open Energy to divide data into different categories depending on sensitivity and security and things like this. And we envisage access requirements differing across data tiers. I've mentioned preemptive licensing a few times. This is a predetermined set of rules under which data can be shared. And finally, a trust framework is the set of governance measures ensuring that data is shared in a trustworthy manner. So for example, we will take certain steps to ensure that participants are appropriately authorized, that they have the right level of access to the right data sets. And as I described, data will be tiered to make sure access requirements differ depending on things like sensitivity. So my final slide is just a quick note about challenges and debates that contextualize Open Energy's work. This is particularly for people who maybe come from outside the energy sector to understand a little bit more about the context in which we're operating. Obviously, some of these challenges are really quite big. So for phase 3, our focusing on a single use case will allow us to unpack these in more depth in a very specific context. So the first thing to talk about is transition pathways. If you come across this phrase, it basically means that across different energy vectors, so that's electricity, heat and transport and buildings, and also in different geographic locations, different vectors will transition to decarbonisation in different ways. Certain transition pathways, particularly around heat, are quite unfixed, and there isn't a definitive government policy guiding work down a particular pathway. So for example, when we look at our use case around local authorities retrofitting, heat decarbonisation will be a transition pathway option that we will have to think about, and data requirements will have to be adjusted accordingly. We will also think quite extensively about privacy and preserving privacy and compliance with data protection legislation, both in terms of dealing with commercial data, in future with personal data, and particularly around data set combination. Within the open energy ecosystem, participants may have access to several different data sets, and we will work with stakeholders to ensure that these are handled in a manner where de-anonymization cannot happen. We also need to think about variable digital maturity across the sector, as essentially we are trying to build a product that can be accessible to everyone. So from a very, very large organization with an in-house extensive IT team, right down to a smaller startup or researcher in a charity, for example, everyone should be able to access this service and to use it more intuitively. So again, we are quite keen to engage with a range of organisations across the sector that can give insights into different requirements from different parts of the sector that may handle digital in different ways. So please offer your thoughts if you have any on this. We also need to think about regulatory remit as we build from foundations in open banking where there was a formal regulatory remit for banks to participate in data sharing. Although, as I've mentioned, there are certain license conditions being introduced to encourage organisations to share data, we don't have the same formal regulatory remit at the moment to encourage organisations to participate in open energy. As such, when we're building the project in phase 3, we need to think about how do we encourage participation without this? How do we deal with any conflict and similar matters? So again, this is something the advisory group around membership will be consulted on. We will also need to think about access rights for data. As I said before, the regulatory impetus to encourage data sharing does not catch all circumstances. So this is something that we'll be again considering with the advisory groups. And finally, as I've mentioned before, we want to create a product that is accessible to all across the sector. So we need to be quite mindful of vested interests in the way that we design, as the system is changing quickly, and we want to make sure that we design something that is accessible and appropriate for everyone in the sector, our kind of catchphrases for the sector by the sector. So when we are consulting and when we're thinking about membership of advisory groups, we really need to make sure that we have a broad range of interests, purposes represented that incorporate commercial, government, or public sector, third sector, etc., to make sure that we really build an inclusive product. This is just to flag a list of references that I've used in this presentation. Again, the slides will be available if you'd like to dig into any of these in any more detail. Just finally, energydata.org.uk is where you can find information related to open energy. And please also look us up on Twitter at Icebreaker1. Thank you very much.